Good morning, class. You're welcome to today's lecture on law and entrepreneurship. In our last class, we tried to conclude on thought and entrepreneurship, and we looked at certain issues under the law of thought, which applies to entrepreneurs. We looked at vicarious liability, we looked at passing off, and we tried to determine how these particular principles of law actually will affect an entrepreneur. And today we'll be moving on to two new topics, and we'll deal with them. And this will be our final topics for this semester. We'll be looking at raising capital, and then we'll be looking at managing risk. Uh, Now let's start with the first topic, which is raising capital or financing. Basically, um, for an entrepreneur to bring into fruition, any of his dreams or his plans in respect to his business, there is a need for capital. Uh, Someone has said that, or refer to capital as the wherewithal to act. That means capital actually gives you the ability, to actually act, on to bring or act on your dreams or act on your ideas. So capital is very essential. Without capital, you cannot actually uh, act on those ideas that you have. So an entrepreneur should actually know how to raise capital in order to carry out his business objectives. Now, one of the simplest ways of raising capital is probably by savings. You just um, set aside certain amount of money from maybe certain incomes that you have or you receive, and then over a period of time you set that money aside, you know over a period of time, and then you invest the bulk, in something profitable. But that kind of to raise money in that particular manner, especially where your income is not so, the income which is coming into your hand is not so much, may to a large extent limit your ability to actually pursue certain kinds of business ideas that will be capital intensive. So when you have capital intensive ideas, it becomes necessary to source capital uh, from external sources. That means you need to go your beyond your means of your source of income and try to tap into certain other kinds of financing. Now, that is what we are going to be looking at today. We are going to look at some of the kinds of financing that will be available to an entrepreneur if you want to actually run a business. Now, one of it is loans, and which is one of the traditional and long-standing method of financing businesses, in the sense that a person can actually approach a bank or a financial institution, maybe a money lender, for the purpose of obtaining loans in order to run his business objectives. Now, there are different ways in which a loan could be obtained. Sometimes you could obtain it by means of a contract. That means you enter into a loan contract, or you could obtain it by means of a bank account, in the sense that you arrange for an overdraft with respect to your bank account. Where it's tied to a bank account, what happens is that you're given, you're actually given credit or allowed to make withdrawals on that particular account in excess of the funds that you actually have in the account. So you can withdraw more than what you actually have in the account and pay back interest, pay back the loan as well as the interest, in that particular account. Or you could have what we call a loan agreement, where an agreement is drawn between the parties and a loan, is actually given. In this particular situation, an account may not necessarily be required, in the sense that the institution or the bank may not actually require you to set up an account with them and fund that particular loan, or that particular loan through the account. So probably a lump sum is given, to you in order to carry out that particular business, which will be repaid, according to the terms of that particular contract. Now, many times, if that particular contract does not contain alongside with it a contract for a collateral security, in the sense that where certain property of the borrower is not advanced in that particular contract as security for the loan, the problem would be that um, where there is a default on on the side of the buyer, the only recourse that um, a lender will have is to actually sue that particular sorry, sue that particular borrower, in a court of law for personal action in order to receive that money. But where you have a collateral, that means a property which is being advanced, as security for that particular loan, then it means that the lender can actually, you know, have recourse to that particular property in the sense that that property could be sold in order to recover the money that was given, to that particular borrower. So in that sense, it provides a level of security for the lender as against just a contract of loan, where, for example, if the seller does not actually have property, or the seller begins to hide, sorry, not seller, the borrower. Sorry, I just finished taking a lecture on sale of goods, so it's still in my mind. So if the borrower actually um, he begins to hide his properties, or the borrower does not have enough properties that could actually uh, actually be used to settle the loan, then, or the debt, then the lender will be at a loss. So sometimes it's important, maybe as a lender, from a financial standpoint, or from a financial institution standpoint, to actually create some mechanism by which some physical property could be used as collateral for that particular loan. Then we have other things that could actually uh, or other kinds of uh, loans, like, for example, where uh, the amount of money that you want to borrow, especially for multinational companies that actually borrow billions and billions of naira, and in that particular case, they may approach a particular financial institution, maybe to require or to request for loans in billions of naira. One of the ways in which financial institutions actually respond to such very huge capital intensive loans is to enter into a syndicate agreement. Syndicate means to get other banks involved, and in order to distribute the risk between of actually advancing that kind of huge loan among several banks. So if, for example, a particular business requires about 20 billion, actually in loan to carry out that particular business, if a bank actually, one singular bank advances 20 million, well, in the event probably the business uh, carried out by that particular borrower does not actually, in our next topic, we'll talk about business risk. So probably unfavorable situations occur in the business that makes it that particular business unprofitable to run at a loss. That particular bank will not be at a loss, in the sense that it will not lose about 20 billion naira, to that particular sector. So what it could do is, knowing the risk involved in the business, it could actually decide to actually distribute the risk by going into what we call a syndicate lending, in the sense that it will invite several banks, maybe several banks, and then they will split that 1 billion naira among themselves. So, for example, it could decide to invite maybe about five banks, and then each bank takes about 200 or advances 200 million, to that particular loan. So, in a sense, in that particular instance, in the event where the business of the borrower does not do well and the borrower is not able to pay, each bank will only lose 200 million, as against one bank losing 1 billion. So in that particular instance, through syndicate lending, you're able to distribute the risk, among yourself. Then you could also have bonds, and this often operates within the context of a company. Many times companies give out bonds, and bonds is a form of borrowing. So you could give out bonds to members of the public, in order to borrow money, to carry out a particular project. Now, number two is the second way in which a comp or an investor could um, raise money is through stakeholding. Stakeholding would basically apply to a company. So, in the sense that an investor could actually open, certain, ownership rights, or give certain ownership rights, in exchange for shares in that particular company. So, certain ownership rights can be given to members of the public or designated person, to actually own a stake or have some ownership rights in that particular business in exchange for certain financial, certain finance, which is actually advanced to that particular company. So in form of shares. So you ask for shareholders, or approach certain persons to become shareholders within your organization. Uh, that the right of shareholding actually will give that particular person certain rights of ownership over the business, in the sense that that particular person can make certain decisions in regards to your business. So you have rights to vote, in the affairs of the business, and right to participate, in the property of the business when the company is being when it's being wound up. So that basically is the right that comes by share stakeholding. Now, when it comes to a loan does not give the lender a right of ownership to the business. So if, for example, you're looking at ownership rights and you want a kind of financing that keeps no, that does not take away your right to own and control that particular business, then probably a loan would be a better option, actually to take. But if um, but it's possible that maybe a loan, bearing the fact that it's more risky, in the sense that you have to pay back a full sum of money, and whether you make losses or you make profit, you still have to pay back the sum and the interest thereof. Probably you may want to now think of sharing ownership by giving certain stakeholding, to other members of the public. And the advantage of that is that those stakeholders will both share in your profit and loss. But the disadvantage of that is that you lose the right of absolute ownership, to that particular business, in the sense that they have a right, to make decisions, with relations to that particular business. So if you go through a stakeholding, to a large extent, the downside to that is that you will lose the right of ownership or the absolute ownership in that particular business, in the sense that the person who actually purchases a stake now has a right to participate in the decision making of that particular business. On the other hand, where it's a loan, the lender does not have a right to participate in the decision making of the business. You still retain ownership, you still retain full control over your business, and you can actually run the business the way you like. But on the other hand, the downside to that, where it's a loan, is that whether you're making a loss, the loan has to be paid. So the loan will still have to be paid at the end of the day. Then number three is what we call communal investment. So communal investment has to do with a pool of investment of capital drawn from ordinary investors, and is invested under a management of a financial professional in a specific type of investment. So what we are talking about is a group of people coming together, and making contribution to into a pool, and that particular pool will be made available, will be invested by a professional, investor, and in order to make profits or increase the revenue. And then from that pool, members can actually take loans from the pool or enjoy dividends from the pool. An example of that is what we have in the form of cooperative societies. So, for example, you could have in a particular establishment at work, a cooperative society, of workers, where workers can would actually agree to for the deduction of certain percentage of their salary monthly, into a particular pool of accounts. So you have different workers, actually contributing to that pool. And then when a member is in need or needs some money, he could just go to the cooperative society and borrow some money, in order to do one or two things. So the money in that pool becomes available to members, in form of loans and also in form of dividends. So that's another way in which loans, or rather finances, could actually be raised. Now let's go to the next topic, which is anticipating and managing risk. Now, when it comes to a business, one thing that is that's often associated with business is risk, in the sense that when you undertake a particular business venture, there are certain outcomes of events that actually could occur in that business, or occur that could actually negatively impact the profitability of that business. So you're not in full control of all the circumstances that surrounds that business, in the sense that things could change from at any time. You could actually be investing in a particular business at periods where the investment climate is very favorable, but over a period of time, investment climates could change. So that probably because for example, if you're producing a particular product and someone else produces a better product than what you're actually producing, you know, sooner or later, demand for your product will drop. People will stop buying your product and start buying the product of the other person. So you could have situations where the circumstances that surrounds your business may actually change in a way that it will make it unprofitable, or to actually engage in. So you'll find out that this particular concept of risk is something that is always inherent in every business venture. Now, there are different types of risk that um, that occurs in a business. We could have what we call market risk, we could have regulatory risk, we could have default risk, we could have systemic risk, and then we could have liquidity risk. Now, when we talk about market risk, we are talking about market related activities or events that are uncertain, that leads to variability or unpredictability in the prices of goods and services. So there are certain things that could occur in a market that could actually uh, change or affect the prices of goods and services. For example, where you're in a competitive market, as I did mention, and for example, you are the only one that started a particular business. Now, if for example you have a monopoly in the market, you're the only person producing a particular product in a business, basically you have the right to charge as much as you want, because depending on demand, you'll be able to charge as much as you want. But the moment other people begin to come into that same business and they begin to charge lower than what you're actually charging, you will have to bring your own prices down, in order to stay competitive in the market. So the entry of the or new entrance into the market of competitors will actually affect the prices of goods. So, and also, for example, where you have superior goods coming in, it could actually even affect the demand for your goods, in the sense that where goods are actually where someone else has manufactured goods that are superior to the goods that you actually have, it could actually affect your goods. Then also you could have goods that are seasonal, in the sense that there are goods that are uh, that people that demand shoots up at a particular time, and that demand falls at a particular time. Let's take, for example, your market is situated in a place like Bowen, and you're actually selling goods or foodstuff to students. Now, the thing is that once the students are on campus, your market will be booming. The moment students leave, what happens? Your market falls, because your customers are not habitual residents of that particular campus. It means they come in seasonally and leave seasonally. So once that season comes in, you make your money, and after the season goes, you are sometimes make nothing, absolutely nothing. So you could have markets that are seasonal, and those seasons will affect the profitability, the prices of your goods, and even the sale of those goods and services. So that's what we mean by market risk. Then number two is regulatory risk. Regulatory risk actually refers to risk uh, that emanates from regulations made by a regulatory authority like government authorities. So where, for example, maybe certain regulations are made by government, those regulations could either facilitate your business, or they could actually stifle your business. For example, if for example you are into production of a local product, and let's say at the time when you started your business, there was an embargo on on importation of that same product from other country, so or other countries. So if you are not facing competition, from foreign competition, to a large extent there will be greater patronage of your product. But the moment maybe a new government comes in and then decides to lift the embargo and allow a flood for foreign products to begin to flood into the market, you may begin to find out that people will begin to shift and begin to buy foreign goods rather than your own locally produced goods. So in that instance, you can see how government regulation can actually affect the profitability of your business. So many times, maybe government putting restriction on importation or removing restriction on importation can actually affect the profitability of local production, within a particular state. So you could have regulatory risk. Then number three is default risk. Default risk actually deals with risk that has to do with payment, in the sense that when people actually receive goods or services, or purchase goods or services, sometimes they purchase it on credit. And the problem with credit sale is that you may not eventually get paid for what you have actually delivered. And so that's a potential risk in business. And many times you may find out that you may have to take that risk. You may have to take the risk of actually selling, your goods, on credit, in the sense that where you have so many people actually selling the same product, when a buyer actually takes your good and promises to pay in the future, at least there is a commitment, that he's going to buy from you and not buy from somebody else. So many times you will, it's a buyer or a seller would, to a large extent, where there are so many competitors, would like to give his goods, and obtain a promise from a buyer that the buyer will pay sometimes in the future, in order to avoid the buyer going to buy from someone else when he has the money. So if the person says, I don't have money now, you can say, take the goods now and pay later, because you want to avoid a situation where when he does have the money, he goes to somebody else to buy those particular goods. So those risks are there. The risk there being in the sense that you want to get a customer and getting committed to buying your product, or getting committed to buying or getting your services, but you're doing that at a risk, where for example, that works. It means that the person, on getting the money, or getting whatever income he's actually expecting, will actually pay up, that particular for that particular good. And then that actually works, in the sense that you have been able to get customers who are for those for your particular business. But where, for example, that person is not trustworthy, or something happens, to that person, that the money he's actually expecting does not actually come, what happens is that you actually make a loss. So there are many times this actually happens, and a business person has to think and be able to weigh creatively how to deal with default risk. Then number four is systemic risk. Systemic risk has to do with uh, the fact that uh, most of the time business activities are interconnected with other organizations, are interconnected with other organizations, and then many times they feed on other organizations. Let me give you an example. If you take, for example, an institution, let's take, for example, a university institution where there is boarding, where there's compulsory boarding, and students are compelled, to stay on campus, not to leave the campus, to feed, to have all their meals on campus, and so on. Now, what happens is that if the university, that particular institution, decides to make that kind of regulation, it means, and then invite private persons, to open cafeterias within that university or within their premises. It means that as long as that university subsists, that those cafeterias will make money, because their ability to make money is dependent on the subsistence of that university. Now, if, for example, that university is wound up, is closed down, for one reason or the other, the owners decide to close down the university, what happens to the cafeterias? The cafeterias begin to make a loss, or they lose business completely. So people begin to lose their business because that particular university is closed down. So in sense, those cafeterias are dependent on the existence of the university. Now, many times you have businesses running like that, in the sense that a particular business is dependent on another business. Either the market, that created by that business, or by services or required by that particular business. Now, where that particular business collapses, you will find out that those other smaller businesses that are tied to that business, or either providing services in that the market created by that business, or providing services to that business directly, will also collapse. So that's what we mean by systemic, in the sense that the failure of one particular business organization could trigger the failure of many other business organizations. So when you have organizations that are intertwined, in the sense that its survival is based on another organization's well-being, then wherever something goes on, or where there is wherever that particular organization maybe begins to make losses, or that particular organization is no more, is wound up or liquidated, then all those other small businesses will also be wound up and liquidated as well, or make serious losses in the process. So that's what we mean by systemic risk. We are talking about a big player in the market actually collapsing, and the collapse of that particular big player triggers a collapse of other businesses that are associated with that particular business. Then we have liquidity risk. Liquidity risk has to do with cash. It has to do with not having sufficient cash, in order to meet certain business needs. Now, there's a difference between uh, cash and assets, in the sense that a business could have assets but may not have a sufficient cash at hand. For example, if you are or let me say this. Many times, it's not profitable for businesses to retain all their revenue in the form of cash, in a bank. Why? Because the interest you will get by depositing your money in a bank is very minimal. Actually, the bank will be making more profit from the money you deposit in the bank, or save in the bank, than you actually are making, or can make, if you actually invest that money in an asset. So, for example, let's say you are making certain money and making certain profit, and instead of investing or putting that money in a bank where the interest or you'll be getting in that bank, or on that particular revenue is not going to be high, what you could do is to begin to invest it in other things. Probably you could begin to buy land, you could begin to buy house or build houses or build estate. Now, what you're doing is you are actually acquiring or putting that money in assets that can appreciate over a period of time. So if you buy land, the value of the land at the time you bought it, and over maybe a period of 10 years or several years, you'll find out that the value of that land will appreciate. So it becomes, you can make much more money, from that particular landed property, than if you have actually put that money in a bank. So if you kept the money in a bank, that particular money will not make as much. That particular the interest rate on that particular saving will not be as high as probably if you went to purchase a particular asset, or bought shares, or bought something else, with that particular money. So many times, what business people do is that instead of keeping their money in the bank, they try to acquire certain assets with that particular money. So the problem with that is that where there is an emergency that requires immediate cash, they may not have cash on hand, in order to meet that particular emergency. So it's very important that a business person weighs those things. Okay, how much money do I convert into an asset, and how much money do I keep as cash on hand? Because there are times where you will actually require cash on hand, in order to meet an emergency. And the problem of us having assets is that it takes a period of time to convert your asset um, to money, to physical cash. So, for example, if you have shares, you need to sell those shares, and it may take a period of time before those shares are actually sold. And if there's an emergency, you may not have the cash, even though you have assets that can actually, from which you can raise that cash, but you don't have the cash at hand to meet that emergency at that particular point in time. So that is what we call liquidity risk, in the sense that you have assets, but those assets will require a period of time to be converted into money, and there is an emergency at hand that requires cash, that requires you to pay and to meet that emergency in cash. And so, in that situation, you're having a problem of liquidity. Not, but it's not that you're insolvent, it's not that you don't have assets that could be converted in cash, but it will take a period of time, which may even outlive that, or which may actually be late for that particular opportunity, or that particular need that you have. So those are some of the risks that a business per se may have. Now, how do you manage risk? Now, there are many ways in which we could manage risk, but we'll just look at just basically three particular ways. We look at mergers, and then acquisition, and then netting agreements. But there are many ways of managing risk. Now, one of the ways in which risk could be managed is through mergers. And mergers occurs when two companies of different ownership and management combine together to form a single enterprise. So when two companies come together to form a single enterprise, you have a merger. Now, merger could occur in different forms. You could have horizontal mergers, which has to do with two companies that engage in the same line of business. So, for example, two universities could come together, or two water factories could come together. They are in the same line of business. So, where you have two companies that engage in the same line of business coming together, then you have a horizontal merger. Then a vertical merger is where you have two companies in the same line of production. For example, let's say you are in the business of producing palm oil, and then someone else is in the business of growing palm trees, palm oil trees. Now, what you could do is that the company that refines the oil and produces the oil could merge with the company that actually grows, the company that owns farms that grows palm trees, palm oil trees. So where that is done, you have what a vertical merger. So they are in the same line of production. You will need people who will grow palm oil trees, in order to produce palm oil. So that is the same line of production. Then you have lateral merger. Lateral merger has to do with merger of companies that produce related goods, but do not compete directly. For example, if you have a transport company, and that transport company decides it's both a road transport, you have one a road transport company, and then you have one a rail transport company. Now, both companies do not compete, in the sense that road transport companies will not compete with rail, and rail does not compete with road. So they are related in the sense that they are both transport companies, but they are not directly competing with each other. So both companies merge together, that will call that a lateral merger. Then you now have a conglomerate merger. Conglomerate merger has to do with companies that of unrelated businesses. So, for example, you could have an educational sector merging with an oil company. So, where those businesses are not related in any way. So, where you have a large company that consists of divisions that are seemingly unrelated of unrelated business, what you have is a conglomerate merger. Now, apart from mergers, you could also actually have what we call takeovers. Takeovers occur where a company buys ownership rights of another company. So one company buys ownership, that means the right of ownership in another company. So it's an acquisition of ownership. Now, the difference between a takeover and a merger is that in a merger, those two companies become one. It's like a marriage. But in an acquisition, the companies remain separate companies. What actually happens is that one of the company becomes a shareholder. That's the holding company becomes a shareholder of the subsidiary company, and the subsidiary company still remains independent as a separate company or on its own, and the holding company remains a separate company on its own. What actually happens is that just ownership. The holding company now has ownership over the subsidiary company. Now, there are different ways in which takeovers could occur. You could have friendly takeovers. That means before the takeover, there is a discussion with the directors of the company that the targeted company. That means the company that the holding company intends to take over, and that discussion uh, leads to an agreement. That means there's an agreement between the directors, and the company or the shareholder intending to take over that particular company, and or that particular agreement is taken to the shareholders of the targeted company, and the shareholders company or shareholders actually ratify that particular agreement. Then you could have a hostile takeover. Hostile takeover takes place where the directors of the targeted company refuse the offer of the holding company. That means the company that wants to take over its own company, and therefore that particular share or that particular shareholder who intends to take over will have to meet the shareholders individually to buy their shares, individually in a manner that will give him control. And then number three is reverse takeover. A reverse takeover occurs where a company which is private buys a public trading company as a means of acquiring a public status without itself being listed. A private company cannot be stated on or cannot trade on a stock market. So, in order for this private company, now what happens is that the private company does not actually want to become public. But what it does, in order to be able to trade on the stock market, it will acquire a public company and use it as a means of trading on the stock market. So we call that a reverse takeover. Then we have a netting agreement. Netting agreement um, has to do with the cancellation of mutual obligations. What we mean by cancellation means that if, for example, two companies are in the constant business of uh, doing business with each other, in the sense that both companies supply products to each other. That means they both buy from each other. It means that there will be money due from both companies to each other. So, for example, Mr. Let's say, um, let's say you have a furniture company, and let's say you have a company that uh, produces wood, and then you have a company that produces paper. Now, let's say, for example, um, the company that produces paper buys woods from the company that produces wood, and the company that produces wood buys paper from the company that produces paper. Now, what happens is that both of them are trading with each other, and in a to a large extent, both of them would need to pay each other for the services or for the goods that both of them buy. Now, one of the ways they can do it is to go into a netting agreement. That means if they can decide to pick periods of time where settlements will be made. So let's say, for example, after every 1 month, they decide to pay for the amount for the goods that have been purchased. So let's say every month, both companies do that, maybe almost every day. The one buys paper, one buys wood. Now, what happens is that at the end of the month, we will look at the transaction of maybe company A that sells wood to the company B that buys paper, and we look at the total transaction, and then we look at company B that sells paper to company A, and we look at the total transaction, how much of paper was sold to company A, and then we look at how much of wood was sold to company B, and then we find the difference between the two. So let's say, for example, the amount of money for spent, or the amount of money in purchasing wood is greater than the amount of money you use to purchase paper. Now, if, for example, the amount of money to purchase wood is greater than the amount of money to purchase paper, what we'll do is that we'll now look. It therefore means that we'll take the difference between the amount of money used to purchase paper from the amount of money used to purchase wood, and whatsoever is the balance will be paid to the wood company. So in a sense, you don't have to pay up the entire transaction fee. All that will be paid will be the balance between what was used to pay to buy wood and what was used to pay buy paper. So that's what we actually mean by netting agreement. You take the difference between the two transactions, and whatever is the balance will be given to the person that has the highest transaction. So if, for example, more the cost, or the amount, the price, or the total sum of for the purchase of wood is greater than the total sum of the purchase for paper, it means that the paper company will have to pay the wood company the balance. That means the difference between what was used to purchase paper from what was used to purchase wood. So that's basically what we mean by netting agreement. Now, this can be used for liquidity. So in a sense, because it means that you don't need to, let's say, for example, the amount of money that was used to buy wood was, let's say, 150,000. The amount of money that was used to buy paper was about, let's say, 120,000. So at the end of the day, what the paper company will have to pay for the wood is just 30,000. The difference between 150 and 120. So in a sense, it does not really need to take 120,000 to give the wood company, and the wood company does not need to pay, oh sorry, 150,000 to give the wood company, and the wood company does not need to give 120,000 to the paper company. So you find out that the amount of money or physical cash required for that, where those transactions will basically be reduced, as against paying the full sum, transactional sum, or for the goods that were actually purchased. So here we are actually trying to limit the amount of money that or cash that is actually paid from one party to the other. So the balance of whatever money can be invested, in assets, or per se. So with that, we come to the end of our teaching on law and entrepreneurship. If you have any question, please send it to me by text message on my number 0816985323. Until maybe our exams, God bless you all. Thank you.